light for short-term and long-term goals and to see how it looks with the technical committee's review and inputs. So with that being said, I just want to give a general overview of some of the things that the technical committee looked at. I'm sorry, I'm getting feedback. Okay, I'm good now. And then we can go into a discussion of the short-term recommendations, and then the long-term recommendations will follow that. So for short-term recommendations, the technical committee took in our recommendations and talked about additional workforce awards, workload adjustments, and internal improvement measures. And for long-term adjustments and recommendations, we talked about at-risk awards. Now, I want to touch on this because I do truly believe at-risk is something we have to look at. The concern I have is rushing to develop a mechanism to do at-risk that may not be ready for prime time. But it is something that I'm really dedicated to looking to in the long term. Another thing is dual credit. Dual credit is a conversation that we'll also be having next week in our subcommittees on Thursday. Transfer and articulation incentives is another one that we will also look at long term. And then of course the awards matrix weights. Now with that, helping lead this conversation is the one leading our technical committee, and you all know him very well, and that is Dr. Harry Rommel. And I want to encourage every single person that is on this call, including our technical committee who have been involved in these conversations with Dr. Rommel and our colleagues, to really contribute to the conversation, because the goal of the steering committee is to develop recommendations for us all to consider when it comes to our higher education funding formula. And the way that we manage these conversations and we think through things may be different from our partners. So I want to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to touch on what they're concerned about, what they agree on, what's a positive, what is something that we need to watch out for that could be a long-term consequence, and things of that nature. So Dr. Rommel, I hope I summarized that pretty well, and I'll go ahead and kick it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Can people see the spreadsheet that I put up? Excellent. Okay, so
Dr. Rommel, I am going to say it's a little small, so if you could zoom in maybe to 85–90%.
How's that?
It's better for me, but it might need to be bigger for other. Okay, that's better.
I'll zoom. You know what I will do is I'll zoom into the pieces that I'm highlighting as we move through. So
thank you.
Let me first preface this by reminding everybody that this is always going to be a draft spreadsheet until the very last second. We're always making, we always seem we're making last minute corrections. I know I have some student credit hour issues to work through with one institution. Dean is working on that. And I do appreciate the vetting that everyone has done through Dee Dee and others in verifying the data. So I am fairly confident that we've got the data glitches worked out, except for maybe one student credit hour issue. That will be fixed, of course, by the time this sheet is complete. A lot of this formula is familiar and has not changed at all. We still have an area for new money. We do have a parameter for base redistribution, which is, of course, set at 0 and will stay that way for our recommendation that we submit next week. We have added a couple of new parameters here. I'm going to highlight these in orange. Excuse me, not in red. Let me do orange instead, just so it's a little different. In response to what we heard from the chairwoman, we do have a parameter for workload adjustment based on a change in student credit hours in 3-year averages from 15 through 17 and 18 through 20. We did not use the FY21 data because we know that is, of course, an anomalous year. So we do have potential for a workload correction, and what that does is it basically subtracts from the new money and redistributes based on the workload share of that institution based on the total workload change across the system. Ricardo did develop a measure of institutional improvement. So all of the current awards, at-risk, STEM-H, and of course student credit hours he developed a really cool model that allows for institutional improvement measures. And that looks at an historical average and a change over time. And what that does is it incentivizes institutions for internal improvement. It's not a competitive model or a market share model like the other measures in the formula are. The technical committee discussed this, and we believe because the at-risk still needs work, if we were to add an institutional improvement measure this year, we could do that for the end of course student credit hours and the total awards, not STEM 8, not at risk, anything else. So just those two measures. Those are parameterized where we can devote, and I'll highlight this in another color. How about green? We can devote a percentage of the new money to those institutional improvement measures. So this is sort of the grant. This is sort of the first sheet that is very similar to what we've had in prior formulas, just with these new boxes in kind of beige and green in terms of the workload correction and the new money. We did discuss, I'm going to go, excuse me while I pull up the next sheet. We've got a lot of tabs here, I apologize. And I'm going to zoom this up as well. That's a little too much. This is the performance outcomes, the student-based outcomes sheet. Again, very similar to what we've done before. We have a protected base, which of course there's no redistribution, so that's just the protected base from last year. This is the new money that's added in. There is a workload correction because all of the student credit hour changes over time have been negative. That is a negative number in this particular scenario. Again, it subtracts from new money. And these are just parameters. I want to emphasize to this whole group that the numbers you see here today are not necessarily what are going to be reflected in our recommendation next week. I need to have discussions with the executive and the secretary about what sort of new money we think is a reasonable request for the higher education institutions. And after our discussion today, there may be additions or subtractions of these measures that we have added to the formula. Again, there is a workload correction, and I can show the details of that workload correction. It simply offsets the new money. And then if we do decide to adopt institutional improvement measures for total awards and for end of course student credit hours, then that would be the portion of that new money that's dedicated to that measure. Again, these are really dummy variables and not reflective of what our recommendation will look like next week. Secretary, did you have a comment?
I do. I just want to note to people, if you have questions, please raise your hand throughout this conversation. And I do see that Director Abby has one.
We need to blow this up. I mean, I hate to be negative about it. They keep taking more and more. Anyway.
Well, thank you for that comment, Mark. Director Abby.
I don't understand the workload correction. Could you try again to explain that? I apologize. I should have been on mute and I wasn't, but that's.
Absolutely. The workload correction now, let me pull that tab up. In response to what we heard from the Legislative Finance Committee in terms of the base perhaps being out of balance due to the decrease in enrollment, what we did was we looked at, and I'll expand this for you. What we did is we looked at the change in the 3-year averages from FY16 through 17 and 18 through 20. We looked at the reduction in total student credit hours across the system. And that is the sort of measure. It's not an enrollment measure, it's a workload measure because it's looking at the total end of course student credit hours. As you can see here, all of those numbers, we have seen a reduction in enrollment and therefore in student credit hour workload. And so we looked at what that historical reduction looked like across the system.
So Harry, can you back up a little bit? Explain that formula, what you're trying to do there in row 3, C3. Explain what that's trying to do.
Row 3, C3.
Column C.
Yes, okay. This is simply
what are you trying to do there?
We're trying to gauge the change in student credit hour outputs from The 3-year period of 15 through 17 and the 3-year period of 18 through 20.
And why 1/3 of the latest three?
That's the 3-year average.
Explain why you picked those years and why you did 1/3 on the most recent period.
It's 1/3 for both periods, Director. It's so that's.
I don't see.
This, we may be missing a parentheses here.
You are. No wonder I was confused.
Ah, there we go.
Dr. Rummel.
I missed a parentheses. I apologize, Director.
Okay.
So that doesn't change. The calculation, however, does take the 1/3 average of both years. I apologize. So that's a change in 3-year averages across those 2 time periods.
So the average of the latest 3 years minus the average for the
Prior.
4, 5, and 6 years ago.
Correct.
Explain the thinking. What were we thinking now that I'm clear on the formula?
What I was trying to gauge here was what has that historical workload looked like over the span, over that span of time, 15 through 20. But to adjust for fluctuations and to keep it consistent with our other mechanisms in the formula, I used 3-year averages.
So in effect, if I can, you're basically reducing workload in the base
Correct.
by, and we've never done anything like this before, or we have? I don't, it looks pretty new to me.
This is new. And again, I do want to emphasize that this is not necessarily, this is a discussion point. This is something that I presented to the technical committee. Go ahead, Secretary.
Dr. Rummel, thank you. I do know that Ricardo is a part of the technical committee and he does have a comment, and it may be in response to the questions that are being asked. If that's the case, Ricardo, can you go ahead and go?
Sure. I'm sorry. I just had a little bit more of a question in terms of the formula itself. Is it based on the weighted unit production, or is it the actual student credit hours?
This is actual raw student credit hours. So it is not weighted by any tiers. It does not go through the matrices.
So may I keep going, Madam Secretary?
Yeah, I thought Ricardo had a comment pertaining to this, so I apologize.
Just in lay terms, we're adjusting base workload by generally by the decline from the last 3 years compared to 4, 5, and 6 years ago.
That is correct.
So tech went down 2% in the last 3 years compared to the previous 4, 5, and 6 years. And so
Yes, sir.
we'll take that out of their base.
That is correct.
All right, well, that's helpful to get that. Thank you, Dr. Rummel. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Just trying to understand it.
Dr. Tannenberg, I know you had a comment.
Yeah, and it's simply a comment. The use of a 3-year average in funding formula is one of the more common approaches. And so this is not unheard of. Actually, it's quite popular just to protect institutions and also to get a more reasonable sense of trajectories rather than blips in either increases or decreases in student credit hours, enrollments, completions, whatever they may be. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you, David. And that is, of course, consistent with how we run all the other measures in the formula with 3-year averages.
Thank you. I do see, Director Abby, go ahead.
Well, okay, so tech went down 2% in enrollment. So we multiply minus 1.97 times what to get those numbers?
That is then
minus 1.97 times X equals 31,000. What's X?
So X is the total reduction across the system. So that would be the net reduction, which is 318,000 That is in column C35. And then depending on the parameterization, which in this case is about 1.6 million, then that share of that $1.6 million reduction would be the 30,000 you see for tech.
So Colin, can you slide that up just slightly, Harry, please?
Which,
Okay. So we went down 318,000 credit hours, and then you got the proportion that every institution is of the 318,000 credit hour decline, and then you applied it to 1.5 million?
that is correct.
Why 1.5 million? Sort of arbitrary, I suppose.
It's an adjustable parameter, which again, sir, is just, right now, it's just a variable.
Okay.
In this case, it ends up being 0.25% of the new money.
So Central loses 200, Central loses. Does it end up, Harry, being pretty proportional to the total or not necessarily? Who are the winners and losers on this? I mean, in some ways you're trying to, the losers ought to be the ones who lost the most enrollment.
That's correct. And Director, this is sort of a market share model when we're looking at the total reduction across the system. How much did each institution, what was their loss relative to the rest of the system? And so because, Central New Mexico was 58,000 credit hours out of the total 318, they're going to take a proportional cut of that 1.6 million.
Okay. I don't mean to monopolize this, but I'm going to stop. If I can make one more point, Madam Chair.
Of course, Director Abby.
I think it's helpful to recognize the declines in enrollment, helpful from a point. I've got members who think it should be recognized. Our budget guidelines say we should fund based on workload. And so I think the direction of this is helpful. I'll just throw out an idea for discussion, because there's enough time to get this right. But one of the things that we were working with was that we would withhold funding in some method like this. I don't think this is a bad method, but then let institutions earn it back based on submitting an enrollment management plan, including metrics, kind of like the metrics I think you're talking about separately, individual institutional goals compared to their peers of how they're going to turn these declines around. So, our scenarios took something like this out of the base rather than new money. I think it probably works the same, more or less the same way. So I'm just throwing out it's not about penalizing, it's about incentivizing them to do better. So that was why we were talking about, and we had a bigger reduction, but also an opportunity to earn it back rather than kind of a permanent recurring reduction. So just a suggestion, Madam Chair.
I also see that there's a lot of folks that have comments and questions, so I want to make sure that I get to those. We have Mark Savager first, then President Shepard, President Rowley, and then President Wells. So Mark, go ahead.
Thank you, Stephanie. So,
and I want to note, Mark, you were a member of the technical committee, right?
Yeah. And okay. That's why I want to shed some light on this. So
Thank you.
This was brought up in the first meeting. And Harry, all due respect, we did bring up this spreadsheet. From the technical committee standpoint, there wasn't an agreement on this. And I think where we ended up at is it's in your memo in terms of a little bit what Director Abby's talking about in terms of language on workload. I think this is something that we decided to hold off on. And we really didn't get into the detail. And then on the 3%, the same thing. The technical group probably should spend more time getting into the detail on that as well. So Madam Secretary, my suggestion is that this is something that there wasn't an agreement on last Friday. And again, I think there probably needs to be more discussion. So I can see why this is perceived as new in terms of for some of the folks. So my suggestion is that, instead of spending a lot of time on this right now, we might want to just set this aside and then move on to some of the other items that we all did agree on that's in the memo. Just a suggestion. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you.
President Shepherd.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I want to go back even further because here in your Excel spreadsheet, you don't have to pull away from this. You have a zero-based redistribution, and I disagree with redistribution, but I do believe in base correction. And I'm going to give a quick example of that, and it does tie into this workload piece because I'm trying to figure out what we're trying to accomplish. And maybe that's the fundamental question that I still don't have a firm answer on. What are we trying to accomplish in terms of 5-10 years from now, in terms of the workforce, in terms of New Mexico, in terms of higher education? I don't think that's been fully addressed. And what it appears is that we're doing is we're layering perhaps insult to injury. And I'll give you the example. So if you were to take a look at previous to COVID, I don't know what it is now, my institution and Highlands Institution, you'd see that they get paid $10 million more. And if you were to take a look at my institution compared to Eastern New Mexico University, you would see that they get paid even less than I do, so therefore less than Highlands. If you were to take a look out on the community college scale, you'd see Roswell is very different than, let's say, Carlsbad, based on local option. And so there's all these inequities in the base. When we start to add performance measures and workload adjustments to that, all we're doing is we're making an error that's already there more and more pronounced. And what you lead toward, unfortunately, is you lead toward disadvantaging different populations within New Mexico. The New Mexicans in Grant County should be treated the same as the New Mexicans in San Miguel County. But now Highlands, having an extra $10 million, which is about equivalent to my total tuition collections, can offer free tuition to San Miguel residents where I can't do that. Then if we take a look at wraparound services that would actually help out with graduation rates and help out with the things that we want to accomplish by this funding formula, I have substantially less money to invest in those. And in my mind, it's no different than taking our poor students and telling them to take a test of the same note of our rich students, but the rich students get the textbook that the state provides. And what that leads toward, and I know this is kind of the elephant perhaps in the room, is something similar to Yazzie versus Martinez, where we have New Mexicans in different parts of the state being treated very differently in terms of the base opportunities toward higher education. Now, I'm not saying that anybody's going to file a lawsuit tomorrow, et cetera, but you're moving, or we seem to be moving down that path. And then if I exacerbate that by moving in and layering on some of these additional formula pieces, including workload, and start taking money away from institutions that are being impacted, at the end of the day, I really believe that we have to address those pieces. The final note to that is I also recognize that not all institutions are the same. And so I'm not asking for equality in terms of money, but similarity, or at least an understanding. I want to go back to David Abbey's point. His point is saying, look, if your enrollment's falling, that should be noticed and that should be understood. And you should have to submit, why is it falling? As opposed to us automatically saying you're going to get a decrease in enrollment. Otherwise, you continue that spiral of reducing that institution to the point where they can no longer be effective in providing their New Mexicans an opportunity to higher education. Similarly, you have to take a look at mission. New Mexico Tech is very different in its size and scope than New Mexico State and UNM, but all three are research institutions. It would seem apparent to me that New Mexico Tech does not have an MBA program or a social work program that can be cash cows that can contribute in terms of economies of scale, and thus they may definitely need more dollars per FTE. Similarly, Northern does not have access to master's degrees to generate those revenues. And so they have some different aspects to them. And it doesn't appear to me that we as a state, or what we're doing here is taking any of that into consideration. But what we're simply doing is saying we need to change the funding formula. Let's add these things to it and move forward and call it a day. And I have a real issue with that.
So let me have Dr. Rommel touch on some of the technical committee and the work that they did and why this was integrated and why he built it in. So Dr. Rommel, I'm going to go to you before I go to other comments.
So thank you, Madam Secretary. So, in developing this model, I was trying to present a potential workload correction, and in response to the comments that we've heard from legislators. I would like to, this is on me. I built this model. I presented to the technical committee, I didn't get any comments regarding the mathematical rigor of the model. And to Director Abby's point, I do believe that we, as a technical committee, did think that this would be there would be an opportunity for institutions to earn that back. I also want to emphasize that this is really just a new money correction. There is no institution that is penalized or loses money overall in the formula. It is designed to be as a mechanism to demonstrate what the workload change has looked like across the system and to incentivize institutions to make those improvements and potentially earn that money back. So it's on me in terms of how the model works. I feel confident that it's a good way to adjust for workload. We don't need to have, but it's this committee, this group, this body that determines whether to adopt anything or not. And I don't want to spend too much time on this workload piece because we do have some other measures that I wanted to discuss today. But I'll just say that, and then we can go to Dr. Wells.
I believe it's Dr. Rowley, and then we'll go to
sorry.
President. Yeah.
Dr. Rowley.
President Rowley.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. So I have a couple of questions, but first, Dr. Ram, I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned that institutions would be able to win back that money. So you're saying that if enrollment were to improve, then we would be able to increase that portion of the funding?
That is correct.
Okay. And then the other thing that I was wondering, we were talking about wraparound services and whether I was wondering, are they going to be built into this so that that's part of the standard calculation for essentially reimbursement? I mean, it's such a big integral part of what we do.
So there is no wraparound service component in this model.
Is that something that I mean, I'm not part of the technical committee or anything, but is that something that could be on the table or?
So Kathy Ulibarri is on the technical committee, President Rowley, and something that we can discuss with our technical members to see what that would look like.
Okay, thank you.
President Wells.
Thank you, Madam Secretary and committee members. This is my first time on this committee, so a lot of stuff looks new to me, and I appreciate what we're trying to do here. But you did want to second a couple of things that Joe said, and that is the base and inequalities in the base. And I think the base has been driven not only by just enrollment decline, and I do appreciate what David Abbey's saying, and I want to come back to that. But it's also been driven by the roller coaster of funding with ups and downs in the state budget. And so most funding formulas that have revenue issues can have big issues, especially for smaller institutions. So I do encourage us to take a look at the base inequality aspects. I think that's really important. The second part is, and I'm glad it's clarified, because I think what I heard from Director Abbey and now from Dr. Rommel is the opportunity to earn this back. So we went through a decline, but in the past 2 years, for the first time, we've increased our incoming freshmen. And that's because we set up a whole different type of plan. And I think if we had the opportunity to present those plans, as Director Abbey is saying, that would be wonderful, because we can show how we've taken things and evaluated and been serious about it and tried to build back address the enrollment issue. So I am highly encouraging that be somehow annotated or put into here. Otherwise, it may be forgotten. Because I think it's a great idea that the director has come up with, and I'm glad we're thinking about that. And at some point, not now because we're on this, I do want to give a perspective from a research institution. So thank you, Secretary and committee members.
President Wells, there will be opportunity at the end, so no worries. I'll make sure to come to you. Director Abbey, it looks like you have another comment pertaining to this subject before we jump to another, so I'll let you go ahead and have the floor.
I do. Thank you. And again, I'll try to be quick. Our thought was to provide the opportunity to earn the money back just by submission of a plan. it's a little tricky to actually reward. We're trying, the goal, by the way, President Shepherd, was to incentivize turning around this decline. That's the goal. I think everybody's kind of on that goal. And so this was trying to set up an introductory bar that institutions would submit a plan to HED, and HED would, give comments, maybe LFC would give comments. And then if it was satisfactory with, in a way, a pretty low bar, because we're trying to turn the ship around and not make it punitive, with a fairly low bar through a proposed plan, at least for FY23. That was our thought about how to earn it back. It'd be pretty hard to earn it back on enrollment in the very year you're introducing it. Thank you.
Director Abby, thank you for that comment, because you of everyone know the concerns of our legislators, and this was something to address some of those concerns of your members. So I appreciate your comments related to that. Dr. Rommel, let's go ahead and move on to the next point. It looks like we need to reconvene our technical committee once more to just go through a couple technical aspects of this, but I'd like to go on to the next point.
Absolutely. Thank you, Secretary. And again, I do want to emphasize that I did not envision a workload correction as punitive either. That is why it's a new money offset. There are several additions where institutions are earning additional funding based on their performance and their outcomes. And this would be a minor correction, again, with the opportunity to earn that back. So thank you. I do want to emphasize that. I would certainly never want to see a formula that penalized institutions. It should be incentivizing performance in every aspect. I do want to just go ahead and talk about the other potential additions or things that we discussed as a technical committee. The top boxes you see here are our current awards, total awards, STEM-H, new workforce, awards to at-risk, and of course the mission-specific measures. The technical committee did agree, and if anyone wants to chime in on this, if I got this wrong, that we shouldn't be making any changes this year to the mission-specific measures, which are the momentum point and the research component. So that would remain unchanged for this year. We did, however.
Dr. Rommel, I do want to touch on momentum points though, because this has been a topic that a lot of people have discussed. The higher education department is dedicated to looking at momentum points during the interim though, and working on a data mechanism that will work in the future formula. So I do want to note that.
Thank you. And because the momentum points are our proxy for transfer, as we develop in over the next interim, other discussions about how to reward and incentivize transfer, we may, phase from momentum points to something else. But we did, I believe, as a technical committee, can agree that those should remain unchanged for this year. If we are going to incorporate an internal improvement measure, and I can discuss the math of that, and I might even defer to Ricardo because he came up with this brilliant model. We can devote a portion of the new money as well to internal improvement. And I'll show you one of those sheets in a minute. And again, just looking at the internal improvements for end of course student credit hours and for total award increase. Again, this is just parameterized. These numbers are merely dummy variables just to illustrate the formula. In addition to that, there was discussion of possibly adding some new workforce measures. When we began the discussion, in earlier drafts, I added 5 zip codes based on workforce needs to the STEM-H measure, but the technical committee suggested that they be removed from the STEM-H workforce measure, be developed separately, and possibly done as a base adjustment for the first year. And so what we've done is develop, excuse me, that's the raw data sheets, sorry. So rather than incorporate new awards into the STEM-H measure, we developed a separate measure that could incentivize those 5 workforce measures but the technical committee did recommend that be, if we do that this year, that be done as a base adjustment. It is, however, built into the formula so that in future years, those could be added and set a certain percentage of money towards those awards. Do I have that correct, Kathy? She's nodding, so. And then excuse me while I find, sorry, I have a lot of tabs to go through here. So that new workforce distribution, I just want to show the folks that it's designed and developed to use the same math as the STEM-H and the awards distributions, the same weightings of tiers, and uses the same award matrices. But it is, again, an adjustable parameter. In this particular draft model, I just looked at what a 1/4% would look, and that's about $557,000. Again, this is a separate measure that can be turned on or off. Were we to add this to the base this year, we would run a separate calculation through this model, but then make a base adjustment and then turn it on next year. And then finally, the internal improvement measures, based on a model that Ricardo has presented to this group before. I believe everyone's seen Ricardo's model. We did incorporate that into the model for consideration this year as well. So those are the changes.
So thank you, Dr. Rommel. I appreciate that. I do want to open it up to questions and comments, but first of all, since Ricardo has been so involved in this component, I want to leave it open for him to comment in case anything is missed or if he wants to add something.
Sure, and again, the entire idea is that institutions would perform against themselves. So if they did better than the previous year or based on a floor, then they would qualify for institutional performance, and then whatever's left over would then go into just a standard distribution as we've done it in the past. So again, it's just based on comments that we've seen and heard from others that institutions should be awarded for doing better than what they've done in the prior year or so. And this way it builds the model up instead of trying to go backwards. And institutions know exactly what they're supposed to do in order to get the institutional performance dollars. So I think, Harry, there was a couple of things that I saw in there that isn't quite built like the way the model was, but it's something that we could still work on.
Yeah, and Ricardo, yes, I was planning that we would reconcile it, but this is basically using your proposed mechanism, and the math should tie out once we get everything worked out.
Kathy, I was actually going to call on you next because I know you were instrumental in this discussion as well, so go ahead.
Thank you, navigating to my mute button. I just really appreciate all of Ricardo's work in putting together this model. I think this is something we've been talking about for a while, is figuring out a way where we basically move more to a system of competing against our own past performance as opposed to competing with each other. Really is a great way to look at inspiring us to improve even more than we have. I will say, and Ricardo, if you wouldn't mind, I get you're saying there might be a few differences in the model that Harry's built here from the spreadsheet that you had, but I do think it would be helpful to dig a little deeper and share some details about actually how the dollars get distributed, you know, and how the calculation works. Just so we all have a shared understanding. Thank you.
Ricardo, did you want to take that, or did you want me to?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Ricardo, I was just saying, I think it would be helpful to walk through the calculation in a little bit more detail so we have a shared understanding of how this would work, specifically how the dollars get allocated at each institution.
Sure, and let's see, Harry, if okay, so this is similar to the sheets that I put together. So basically, yes, what we're looking at here is the criteria data, which the criteria data is based on the weighted units that were produced for end of course student credit hours here. So it's the actual raw data multiplied times the 3x3 matrix on the cost factor table. So what the first column here is the institutional floor. And what this is it's looking back all the way back to 2015 to look at what was the maximum amount of weighted student credit hours that were produced. And so it's from FY 15 through FY 21. And there's a factor in there of like 90%. So it's 90% of that total, because the expectation is that we can't expect institutions to continue to grow year after year. For example, if you look at a graduate's only going to get to 100%. So it's establishing a floor. So that's what this first column is. It's 90% of what the overall maximum amount was. So for example, in FY 22, if the new data shows that is the maximum year, then that becomes the new maximum times 90%. So then what the next column is showing, the prior FY 21, that is the weighted student credit hours for FY 21. And then the next column is the FY 22 amounts. So basically what this is doing, it's comparing the most current value, which is highlighted right now, to the previous years. And if it exceeds those amounts, then if it exceeds any of those amounts, then you qualify for institutional performance. So in this case, for example, let's go to the row that's the first row here, which is on the comprehensive side, row 21. Eastern New Mexico exceeded the institutional floor, so they would qualify for some additional funding. So that in this case, it's true. In the case of the next three items, they're also true, because they were yes in regards to exceeding the institutional floor or the prior year data as well. And then the next column is developed using the existing methodology. So basically, it is just the institution's share of the overall weighted student credit hours. So nothing's changed in the formula. We're using the existing distribution methodology. And of the amount that is available for institutional performance, an institution would gain, in this example, Eastern would get 6.2% of whatever was available. So they would get a total of $62,000. And then after you add up all of the totals of what everybody received under institutional performance, whatever's left over then goes into the standard or regular allocation as we're doing today. So the remaining money goes to everybody else. So basically what you're doing here is you're awarding institutions for exceeding their past performance. So it's basically a growth model. So that way institutions are, again, awarded for exceeding their past performance. And then the next column here is the total allocation. So it's just the regular allocation plus the institutional performance added up together. So again, the whole idea is that institutions compete against themselves. If they exceed their institutional performance, their past year data, they're going to get rewarded for it, because that's what I think that's what the LFC and what our legislators are wanting institutions to do. They want institutions to grow. So this model takes away some of the things that the other model did not do, and each institution is responsible for their own growth. The other positive thing is once these numbers are developed, you know what you need to do to beat the prior year data. So as a president, chancellor of an institution, you have your targets already set for you, and you need to be able to adjust in order to exceed those targets. So that's the whole idea.
Thanks, Ricardo. I would have mangled something, but thank you for that explanation. You did a much better job than I would have. It's always difficult to explain someone else's work, so I thank you for that. Kat, I see, Secretary, I'm going to go to you, and then it's Kathy.
No, I was actually going to jump over to Kathy.
Thanks, and I just want to thank Ricardo for the explanation. Just a couple of key takeaways that I think is important is this column of share of weighted data on current fiscal year. Built into this is that doesn't change. So it keeps sector equity, if you will, and the proportionality based on current appropriations. So that's one thing to note. And the second thing I'll note is rather than comparing the performance details, the actual outcome data like number of awards or whatnot, it's basing it on the comparison of dollars one year to the next. So, you know, it's assuming that our current method for allocating dollars is what we're going to stick with. And I just think those are important points to point out. Thank you.
Just one other important point that I missed is that the items, the weighted items are based on the 3x10 matrix for everybody. So those are the cost factors. I didn't mention that earlier. So it eliminates all of these different cost factors that everybody has. So this way everybody's on the same cost factor matrix. The other thing that this allows for, it's easy, it's a lot easier to see, well, how are institutions performing against each other as well too. So that's one of the other things that it does do. So it eliminates that very complex normalization process that was in the current formula.
Thank you, Ricardo. So that sums up the changes that were made to this draft formula. I just want to, sorry, go ahead, Secretary. Go ahead, Secretary.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Armo. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure. So, Mark, I see that you have a comment.
Thank you, Stephanie. So on the 3-year average, in terms of, I guess I still feel like we didn't have more in-depth conversation about that. And I'm not saying I disagree or agree with it. It's just, I'm concerned that, I mean, and just like kind of like with the workload, when Stephanie, when you mentioned maybe the technical group needs to go back and look at this, I'm just wondering if, you know, what are you suggesting? Is it just going to be the workload, or is it going to be the 3-year average? And I know we talked about Ricardo's. Ricardo's has shared his with everybody for months now, but that's just, those are the two things that I feel like there just wasn't consensus, not necessarily on, I think everybody agrees that we have to be accountable on workload. But again, in terms of how we were able to come up with an amount that, say, for example, there is language that's withheld based on an enrollment plan being produced and so on, or even on the 3-year average, again, I feel like
Mark,
there wasn't enough work.
You're right. There was no consensus. There is a part of the agenda towards the end where we can talk about next steps and those types of things. But I really want to focus on the current things that are being presented so that we can stay on task and we can get to the last point of short-term options. But yes, we'll discuss that at the very end. Thank you. Director Abby, do you have a point related to this?
The 3-year average is part of this discussion, Madam Secretary. It's right there in front of us, the weighted 3-year average. That's why I'm bringing it up. It's on this sheet that Harry's sharing with us. Thank you.
Dr. Rummel, do you have a comment?
I do want to comment that, you know, the 3-year averages are how we've been computing everything in the current formula. That was, you know, that is so any use of 3-year averages within this formula is consistent with how we've done it over the past 6 years.
And I'm just referring to the changes. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to the last point.
No. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Director Abby?
Yeah, I think this is interesting, this institutional measures and trying to reward performance individually rather than the pool. I would point out that we used to heavily rely on funding student credit hours, and we got away from it for many good reasons. You know, I remember looking at data like the average credit hour for graduates was like 180. I mean, students, we wanted to move from inputs to outcomes. And that's why we have the measures on completing degrees. And in some ways, this is going backwards, but on the other hand, I agree also, it's going backwards because the decline in enrollment ultimately will affect the outcomes, and sooner than later, we want to almost like nip it in the bud in effect. So I think.
I think you muted yourself, Director.
How I did that? When? Could you hear any of what I said, or do I have to start over?
We got up to, I think.
Anyway, I'm
Here's the
trying to say,
enrollment
it looks
component.
like it's moving backwards, but it has merit because we're trying to draw more attention to enrollment. We'll pay if we don't. So I think I applaud the effort and initiative. My last caveat is, this is really hard to follow on Zoom. I understand that these sheets just went out recently, and I don't have a copy in front of me. And I know that in about 10 days, Madam Secretary, you've got to have a recommendation. I support the direction of this. From what I understand of it, I think it's worth pursuing even for this cycle. I don't think it, in some ways, I think some fine tuning might be able to happen between, even after you submit a recommendation. So I'm interested enough to keep working on it, and I wouldn't be, I think it's responsive to what our members have asked for, and we shouldn't be totally, maybe the technical committee can keep working even into early November to fine tune this and maybe generate better consensus than I'm not clear that this is a consensus report or not, because we've never seen it today, is what I understand. So thank you.
So I'll work with Dr. Rommel to see if we can get these sheets to you, because I think that is critical. I'm sorry about not getting these out. We're on very tight timelines, as you know, but I'll touch base. And I appreciate your commitment to continuing these conversations with higher education leaders, because their institutions are impacted and they need to be a part of the conversation. Dr. Rommel, I think we can move over to the last short-term goal before we go over to long-term discussion points and then closing and next steps.
I believe this covers the last short-term goal, Secretary. I do want to emphasize that the drafts that have been going out, the last was on the 18th. The only thing that this draft, which will go out today, has not shown were the internal performance measures that we just discussed. So the group has seen all the other changes that I incorporated into the formula. And again, I just want to emphasize that everything here is parameterized and can be turned on or off, as consensus is developed. I just want to emphasize that.
Thank you, Dr. Rommel. So there are some long-term adjustments that have been discussed by all of us, and I just want to make sure that we're still in agreement that these are conversations that we want to have in the interim after the 30-day session. And if there's any glaring concerns or things that we need to talk through today, I'd be more than happy to do that. So the first, I'm just going to list them out, and Dr. Rommel can provide more context, and so can some of our other members. But at-risk awards, as I stated, this is something we really do want to visit. It wasn't something that we could get accomplished, though, in the short term. So that's why it's moved over into our long-term list. Dual credit, active conversation that is happening in all sectors right now in state government and outside of state government. Transfer and articulation incentives. We'll be really working on refining data related to transfer in the interim. That's something that I'm really committed to, and really evaluating momentum points. But right now, it's the most accurate measure that we can use to really look at that. And then the last is the awards matrix weights. I know this is something that we've all discussed. We really need to update those. And with that, any comments related to long-term adjustments, or I'm sorry, recommendations and considerations?
Secretary, I know David has his hand up. I do want to remind everyone that the technical group has decided or has agreed that we would all start meeting basically as soon as House Bill 2 is signed next year. Clearly, we didn't have a lot of time to get through, changes this year, and we heard that. And again, I just want to emphasize that nothing is set in stone. Everything's parameterized, but I felt like we should at least build some of these models for discussion. But we will be beginning our work immediately after the session next year.
Thank you, Dr. Rommel. Director Abby, your hand was up first, and then Mark, and then President Wells.
Thank you. Two things. Back to the short term here, Dr. Rommel, I appreciate you sent it out Monday. But But again, for the members of the full group and not the technical group, I like a meeting in person where I have the spreadsheets in front of me and I can try to understand the expertise of the technical group. And again, I like the direction, but I also want to get a little more comfortable with the details. On the long-term stuff, the elephant in the room, and it was really remarkable that both President Wells and President Shepherd brought it up, and I don't think it was on your list. It's the hardest one of all. It's here we have a base plus formula with major doubts about the equity of the base. And that's, yeah, it's the elephant in the room. How do you fix it? And I think it's been simmering for a long time, and it's sort of erupting. You know, and why do I think that? Because I see presidents coming to the Capitol to talk about the inequities of the base, and it, you know, we're probably going to see proposals for non-formula equity adjustments. We've seen them the last 2 years. It's probably coming again. So for unfinished business, that's in a way the hardest, but perhaps foremost of your, that I would add to your list, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Director Abby. I did add that as something we can look at. So thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Okay, good.
No. You mentioned it and I added it to my list right now. I'm sorry. I should have clarified that. And Director Abby, maybe you can help me get some capital space so we can be in person next time. How about that?
You know, the best place to meet is our conference room.
All right.
You
I
know,
might hold you to that then, okay?
It's big enough to accommodate people, and we will mask, and we could have hard copies in front of us.
Okay.
It's a better way to go.
Thank you, Director Abby. Mark, I have you next.
Do you mind, Stephanie, if President Wells goes first? Because
Not at all.
Because we're talking about long-term issues right now. Is that what we're on? In terms
Yes,
of we're on
long-term.
Well, I'd like to go after President Wells if that's okay.
That's fine. President Wells?
Yes, Madam Secretary and committee members. You know, I think the other thing that has to be added is related to research. Our state really sits on the threshold of making some significant moves, thanks to both the legislative activities and the governor. And that all evolves around what's known as an innovation-based ecosystem or economy. And it doesn't just stick with the research institutions. It goes all the way down to the 2-year. They're very instrumental in an innovation-based economy as well. But we don't talk about that. And this comes back to President Shepherd's first thing. What are we trying to do here? What do we want higher education to look like in 10 years? And I appreciate the details and really appreciate the creative work that Harry and Ricardo has done. But I really think we have to think about research, you know, because not only does it provide innovation, but it changes the whole socioeconomic aspects of a state. And so if you look at where we are, and again, people are going to get tired of me saying this, but there's an institution that looks at all the states based on the research activity, and they measure that in terms of how it impacts the economy. It's the Milken Institute. And we here in New Mexico, we're sitting at 18th. We've come up 6 points in 2 years. Why have we done that? Well, that's because we focused on technology and science workforce. And so that's an advanced workforce, just like the workforce that the 2 years produce. Research institutions comprehensive produce an advanced workforce. Engineering scientists, a bachelor's, master's, and PhD. And an innovation-based economy really depends upon that. And we're being recognized for moving in the right direction. So I think there's some time to put some creativity in how we would measure that and the roles that university play. The other thing we came up in is sort of the concentration of technology. And that's because we have national labs here. They are a major hire. I had the leadership from Intel in my house, you know, talking about where they're going and how we can be better prepared for our students. And so research is very, very critical in this. And I'm hoping we will add something to the research award. And I know we have opportunities like Senator Souls, but we need to build that into a formula to have one that's totally comprehensive and effective. And my final point, and this comes back to, we're not all the same institutions. I admire the two-year colleges for what they do. My wife taught when she was here before in a two-year college. The research institutions do things differently, but I'm different from the two research institutions. And so I think, you know, and this is sort of a selfish pitch, but we have to think about, we have things like NMHED. We have things that are different. New Mexico Tech is really different, even though it's a research institution. And so I'd like to, at some point, have a little bit of discussion with this group about how a technical institution that's recognized for, you know, producing students that have $10,000 more base income than Harvard, that it's the fourth in the nation for Hispanic serving STEM, and 80% of our graduating students either go to graduate school or have jobs in hand. How does that compete? Because the past funding formula, it was just a treadmill, $300,000, $400,000, no matter what. And so that's the selfish part, but the less than selfish part is, let's take a look at putting research in as we consider the long term. And I think there's some real creative opportunities we can look at in terms of external evaluations and what other universities do. Thank you.
President Wells, thank you for bringing that up. Actually, the first meeting that we had, your colleague, President Shepard, was really fantastic in talking about research and really evaluating that in the funding formula. And even your two-year sector colleagues echoed that as something we should review and evaluate. So I apologize that it wasn't on my list. It is now on my list, and we'll have that discussion. I also want to know that research was left in the funding formula untouched from what we were looking at right now because of some of the points that you mentioned, but I'm dedicated to evaluating it going on. And with that, I do want to touch Mark. Do you want to comment now?
Yes, thank you. And I just want to make sure, because I didn't want to get in front of President Wells. And so thank you, President Wells. And well, I think, Stephanie, what we maybe want to add to it is, you know, when you have the number of items on the long term, is looking at something in terms of a research award that, you know, adding an innovative research and economic development component to the formula to help create an innovative economy for New Mexico. I mean, I can work with Harry on some language and send it. And then I think the other thing that I think I see President Shepard will probably touch base on, so I can at least just suggest it, is something on base adjustments. I know I've been a broken record on this, but I do know other states do have out of cycle base adjustments on their formulas. I know we do get new money, but the new money usually doesn't cover inflationary increases. There are inequalities within the base that I think that we need to take a look at, whether it's, you know, in terms of base comparisons to some of our schools within the CUP, when you get the local option compared to some of the branches and coming to the independents. I mean, you know, in terms of the inequities there, I think we as a group really need to look at the inequalities within the base. And so what I suggest is something like base adjustments or evaluate inequalities within the base would be something we want to look at on a long-term basis. And then on an accountability component, Harry, appreciate you adding that language on the review. I probably want to make it a little tougher when it comes to taxpayers and when it comes to the fact that within the existing formula, we really have not really reviewed this except for maybe every 5 years or when the LFC did their evaluation. But something that does not just review, but I think Kathy's Mulabadi's kind of leaned to this as a review of certificates, but also like when our bachelor's degrees, you know, we have to have faculty approval on those. Then they have to go to HED for approval. Then they have to go on master's and PhD. They go up to the Board of Finance. So there's there's a lot of scrutiny on those, and there's a very lengthy approval process. I do suggest that I think the chair of LFC, and I don't think it's got a turn, is something that has some type of approval or review process on certificates in general, in terms of would that add to that accountability measure? And then I think just all awards and measures in the not just the new ones, but all of them. So something like that we want to try to incorporate. I think we owe it to the taxpayers, we owe it to the legislators who have to respond to their constituents, is that this formula really should show accountability as well. So those are some of the things. And then I think we also talked in the technical group that back to you, what you mentioned, Stephanie, is that in terms of the SIPs that are being added, in terms of, we also are looking forward to support from everyone on the research closing fund as well. So I think that's something that I think we all agreed upon, that's the bigger picture for research, is that research closing fund. And I just also want to apologize to Harry in terms of, I got my streams crossed in terms of the 5-year workload average compared to the 3 years. So thank you for clarifying that. So that's not an issue. And so with that, thank you for listening. Thank you.
So Mark, thank you for those comments. I will ask that you, Kathy, and Ty stay on, because I have to give you an update related to some economic development stuff that you triggered my mind about. So stay on after this. And I had another comment, but it's escaped my mind. I'll come back to that. So Director Abby, you're next, and then we'll go to Kathy.
Let's go to Kathy first. I'm waiting for a document.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much. And I just want to let everyone know that I do agree with what Mark Saavedra is saying. I want to clarify, though, on the approval of certificates. We need to be careful that we do this in a way that doesn't hamstring our institution's ability to be super responsive to employers, because that's really the strength of community colleges, is to be able to stand up a certificate program within a couple of weeks to respond to an employer's needs. When I say approval of certificates, I think that means for funding. And I do think it is absolutely a wise thing to do, for all the reasons Mark Saavedra stated, to have some sort of, say, annual review process where we determine if certificates should be eligible for state funding or not. And I also really support anything we can do to streamline the approval processes of all the different degree levels for the other institutions as well, so they can be super responsive to their constituents too. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Director Abby, I see that you got your document.
You're muted, sir.
I was looking at the statutes. Maybe Kathy Ulibarri can help me, but I think when the formula was first, the base plus formula was first established, Marilyn Budke was the chair of that group. And I believe they set in statutes some funds that we've never really used to be companions to the formula. And if I'm not correct, there was a research fund. Kathy's nodding her head. I hope I'm right. I couldn't quite find it fast enough. But I think, President Wells, I'm really, I've heard your comment about research a lot, and especially with non-recurring revenue is an opportunity to address that need more than we probably can. You look at the research dollars in the formula recurring, it's pretty tiny. It's not going to move the needle. You want to move the needle in a big way. And I would urge, again, I don't view this so much as a formula issue as an opportunity with a lot of non-recurring revenue to go back to the intent of that fund and come up. President Wells, I'd like to see a proposal from you and your colleagues in research on more specifics, maybe through using that statute on how, more specifics on what you would do with it, because I've heard it a lot. I think it has merit, but to sell it, you need more detail. So thank you.
Director Abby, I have to echo that sentiment. A lot of people are bringing up that fund, but I haven't seen anything hit my desk. So I would love to have more information.
Madam Secretary, if I may, Director Abby is correct. There were actually a couple of funds created, the research fund being one. And I think that's a great way to really invest in and spur research. But I do support the notion of ongoing, when the results of that research really show up as positive performance improvements, I still support the idea of a performance recognition for that as well. But the other fund that we haven't talked about in a long time is, I think it's called the Program Enhancement Fund. And we struggle with the idea of these new SIPs coming on board to focus on workforce issues. We struggle with a number of RPSPs that come forward for startup funding for new academic programs that theoretically shouldn't be a part of an RPSP process. If we could routinely fund that program enhancement fund, that was the fund that was intended to provide startup funding for new programs that are really needed in our state. So I just want to put that out there too. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Harry, let's have a sidebar on that when you have a chance. I know you're busy today. President Wells?
Just quickly to follow up on Kathy, I think the idea of the new programs through that kind of enhancement is a much better way. That, I mean, part of the problem with these RPSPs is and I've talked about this, I think, with Harry off and on, that they really are, they need to be folded into academic programs. And we've done that for a couple of things, like the space one we had. But I really like this idea, and I would encourage us to take a look at that as a really important step. So I don't know much about it. So Kathy, if you don't mind, I'll follow up with you because I'd like to learn more about that.
Madam Chair, I found the statute, 21-1-27.2. It's the Technology Enhancement Fund. And it says, money in the fund shall be used to provide matching funds to state research universities to support innovative applied research in ag, biotech, medicine, materials science, and so forth. And we were supposed to do that when the new Base Plus formula started, and I agree also with the Performance Fund. And rather than reinvent the wheel on research, it is a much easier story to build this as unfinished business.
Agreed. I'd rather do that than reinvent the wheel. All right. That really does conclude this meeting today. As you can see, we need to follow up with you all on these tables and charts, which we will absolutely do. So count on that either in your inbox at the end of today or early on Monday. I think we need to reconvene the technical committee once more, in which I would like to be a part of that conversation. So Harry will get that in the books and I will make time to be there. And with that, I will follow up with each of you, and you know how to find me. Kathy, Mark, Ty, please stay on. And my team, you're free to go today to your next meetings. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Edna.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, members.